whether it's a health problem, someone struggling to cope in life, all of those things, we might feel like the God of the Bible is maybe a bit firm and stern, and we don't want to question perhaps, or we don't want to speak or lament. And I think we don't understand in the West exactly what a lament is compared to the Eastern cultures, and particularly in the Old Testament, what a lament actually was. And sackcloth is this not on? Okay. Anyway, if I came in here with sackcloth and ashes, which maybe I should have, you would all have a very strange reaction, but that would have been normal to show your grief in that way. Anyway, I'm going to read from 1 Kings 19, verse 4. This is right after Mount Carmel. This is Elijah. And if you think about Mount Carmel, ever since I was a child, I thought, wow, what an amazing experience that would be to see when you are kind of alone and you see the prophets of Baal, the 400 prophets of Baal, and you have this contest. And notice the confidence that Elijah has. And he says, or the whole, the order of events where Elijah, the altars and the water and the water and the water, and how the heathens cut themselves, and Elijah mocks them with this, and he has this confidence. And what's strange is what happens immediately after that. If you saw fire come down from heaven in front of the heathen and it burned up water, and then you and your friends, well, this is disgusting, but you killed 400 prophets of Baal, and you squashed that false religion, in a sense, at least there, I think you should feel pretty good, right? You should feel pretty excited about what God is doing in Israel. But this is the response that Elijah has when it's actually Ahab and Jezebel are seeking his life. Verse 4, let's see here. This is the King James. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him, and he said unto him, "Arise and eat." Verse 6, and he looked, and behold, there was a cake baken on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink, and laid him down again. And the angel of the Lord came the second time, and touched him, and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee." And he arose, and did eat and drink, and went in strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto the horror of the mount of God. That's pretty miraculous. But continuing on, and he came thither unto a cave, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and said unto him, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thine prophets with the sword. And I, even I, only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go forth, and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by. And a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. And it was so that when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out and stood in the entering of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him, and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And Elijah repeats the same thing. In verse 15, God speaks again, and he says, And the Lord said unto him, Go, return unto thy way to the wilderness of Damascus. When thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Skipping down to verse 19. So he departed thence, and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. And it continues where he joins up with Elisha. So I'm going to make some interpretation here. Maybe you'll disagree with it, or kind of what I've gathered from that passage after reading it a few times. Elijah has this Mount Carmel experience, which is loud, dynamic, exciting, disgusting, It's very hot. There's a lot of fire involved. It's an incredible sort of dramatic scene that we all kind of like to see. We all want to see. At least I would like to see the fire from heaven. This great display of God's revelation. And then he goes into the wilderness, and it's like it never happened, or it didn't have an effect on him. It's not like it increased his faith like 7 times greater or something. And he goes and he sleeps, and God comes to him and says, here, eat, or the angel comes, eat, drink. And he comes a second time, eat, drink. Do we notice God's careful love and attention for Elijah when he's going through this emotional turbulence, or maybe not a depression, but this low point? For whatever reason, Elijah is you could say tanking. He's in a seriously low time. And God shows this attention not just once, but twice. And then he goes out and he questions Elijah, and he lives there. And it says that, God came by in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, and God was not in any of those. They were loud, they were dynamic, they were dramatic, they were things we want to see, but God was not in that. But then came the still small voice. And if I can make an analogy or an application perhaps to this question, for many of us, when we face suffering or we face that pain, emotional or physical, we want a big display of God's revelation. We want God to show up and make things better. But often it's not in the dramatic or the sudden or the miraculous. It's in the still small voice. And if we can keep that in our minds throughout this topic, I think it's quite helpful. But it also shows that Elijah, one of the man who was taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot, struggled. He struggled to go through with God's mission. It was too much for him. God, word for word, it says in the Bible, it is too much for you. You cannot do it alone. So when we face suffering, it is too much for us. God is compassionate. He is tender. He understands. He will wake us up twice and feed us and give us water. And he cares about those little moments in our days and our times when we may struggle sincerely and deeply, and it seems like it just never ends. And that's why I love that story. I heard one man, he read the story, he said, Elijah's just having a pity party. And I was like, wait a second, this is a holy guy, this is a prophet. Also, he survived for 40 days on that food. I think you're wrong. Or I don't like your interpretation. Maybe you don't like mine, but I think that's something to remember as we go through this topic. C.S. Lewis said something to the effect that when we're in pleasure, when we're enjoying our life in pleasure, God whispers to us. Or it's as if the voice of God is whispering. He also speaks to us through our conscience. But when we are in pain, he is shouting to us. That's what his voice may sound like. When we are in pain, we're not only listening for his voice, but he's doing something to the world. It says it is his megaphone, C.S. Lewis says, his megaphone to awaken or arouse a deaf world. What does that mean? I think there's a lot of people, in ourselves included, think life will go on as it has been, as Revelation says. They will go on eating and drinking and marrying. Things will just keep going. And I am completely happy in this sort of cycle that I am experiencing in life, and not anything's really in the way. But what does it take more than a loss of a family member or an illness in your own life or some sort of suffering? Suddenly everything's different. Suddenly nothing else matters except for that thing. When someone's in critical condition, when someone is struggling, when someone needs help. And it awakens us. Sometimes we forget, I think, that the world is evil and Satan is out there and the effects of sin are real. All right, we're going to move into the main question, and this is said to be the most successful charge against Christianity and people doubting Christianity. That, I think it's more of that, this is one of the most profound questions of life, perhaps. In that which way you go in the end, it makes a huge difference, but I think Christianity, of course, has an answer. And when you're awakened into this, you realize the world is not as it should be. When the world, there seems to be a contradiction, you might think that a loving God should not allow this. Then it's time, then you begin to think. First of all, you may not understand then the meaning of the word loving. in that instance. So this is what many people will say: there is too much evil in the world for God to exist. I can't believe there's a God because look at all the starvation and all these things. That's making the assumption that before this, nothing ever happened that caused what is now. So that's one point you can think about. Secondly, people will say something like this: if God is loving, he would not allow evil in the world. There is evil in the world, therefore there is no God in the world. But the first statement is wrong, because it's assuming that God and evil cannot exist in the same world. And even more than that, if you ask or state this question or statement, you are asking that on the foundation of a Western worldview. Generally speaking, I'm making a general statement there, very general, and we'll talk about that in a moment. If you even ask this question, you're assuming some things. You're assuming justice, and you're also assuming the very existence of God. What is the response to this? If someone is in severe pain, if someone is mourning death of someone, do you say to them, I have a logical and philosophical answer for you. I'm going to sketch it out on this napkin, and you're going to feel a whole lot better when I'm done. Is there any words you could state that would make all their pain go away? No, because if you could, you must be a prophet or something, or working miracles. No statements of logical, like the next point will be no logical progression like this is ever going to, just alleviate someone's pain. Like, oh, I feel better. I can cope now with life in this horrible situation I'm in. So I think there's some validity, or there's some importance to these statements, or a statement like this. For the person who's asking it, how should we say, not in a vacuum, but out of a more like thinking question. I think there are people where it's a heart issue, or it's a heart cry. So here's how it goes. If you ask this question, how can there be a God when there's so much evil in the world? Well, you're assuming a number of things. When you say evil, I have it all up there at once. Anyway, when you say evil, there must be a thing called what? Good. So if you say evil, say that's evil, you make a moral claim, there also has to be an opposite to that evil, and that would be good. And it's not that evil has to exist for good to exist, as we see in the garden, but for evil to exist, good must exist, the contrast. How do you tell the two apart? There is no such thing as kind of like the Eastern philosophies anyway. There has to be a moral law, some sort of measuring stick that tells you what is evil and what is good. And it cannot be evolution, where it states what is good is what's good for your tribe, or what is good is what's good for human flourishing. What's the problem with that? If I say, hey, don't steal my cows, it's not good for human flourishing, what are you going to say? So? It's good for exactly. It's good for me. What's good for me is good for you. How do you like that morality? When you have a standard, a moral law that is built on some sort of flimsy idea, you can say, I value that. I value when people don't take my stuff. But I cannot say, you have a duty not to take my stuff. Okay? Atheists have moral values. They say we should be peaceful, loving, kind. There are many atheists who are, good citizens and not, wicked, wildly evil people, or whatever you want to say. However, like an animal, there's no moral law, because any morality comes from another animal or an instinct. In the same sense, if there's nothing above a moral law, if there's nothing above just law in general in a country, then it's kind of meaningless. With one, we kind of make an exception. What happens if you murder someone in this country? You go to prison. Okay, so that's we have a very strong incentive. Don't do that. Otherwise, you'll go to prison and it will be miserable. or if the police show up, you will obey me, because if you don't, I'm holding a weapon and I will end your life. On pain of death, you will obey the law. That's the only way that humankind can control other members of its own tribe, or whatever you want to say. And even then, there's some serious problems with that argument. That's what some people might argue for. Well, the state is the moral or lawful authority. There's many problems with that statement. We won't talk about it. So if we want a moral law that means anything, there has to be a moral lawgiver, a moral authority, and they can't be another human, and they can't be bound in this world. So if that's not, it throws everything off the table except for one thing, which is a God who has existed forever and who is good. And if God exists and he is good, cannot be evil, and he is the standard for what is good and what is bad. What's the problem? We've just ended where we started. If there is that moral authority, only one, when we're done describing that, whatever that philosophical thing is, you can just pretty much add, oh, he's holy, righteous, just, good, on and on and on. He's God. So if you ask this question, it might be that you were born in a country in a Western civilization, because you have the very thing you try to disprove is the very thing you need to ask the question. So in order for me to ask the question, I'm standing on a stepladder, but I'm trying to destroy that stepladder by talking about that stepladder. Or any kind of foundation like that. It doesn't make any sense. It's not even a question. If there's so much evil, good, measurable, leads to God, how can God exist in the world? That progression is helpful for you to think about and to talk about with non-believers to stir their thinking, because that is not a logical statement. All right. There are people who say, I reject God. Okay? You reject God and you reject biblical laws, morals. You reject any kind of standard. And you're left in this sort of gray area where there's no good and there's no evil. There's only preference. And then you have these weird questions where they ask people like, what if I did this? Would that be wrong? And they say, no. What if I, murdered a child? Would that be wrong? There's no such thing as wrong. No, I wouldn't like it. You wouldn't like it. I mean, that's a very scary statement to make. But if you don't believe in God, you have no standard, no firm standard, no unchanging standard. Therefore, if you can get away with it, in a sense, even the first philosophers after, quote-unquote, the death of God in the 1900s, they say the moment God is dead, murder is fine, is what he says, the philosopher Albert Camus. And he was a very, I would say, rather dark person. The alternative is to live your life without any measurement of good and evil, and just to kind of plod along without any answer. So you can have an answer you don't like, or you can have no answer. Is this an easy answer always? Is this and the following argument always an easy thing to accept in suffering? Of course not. These words just kind of look like words and not actually something that helps you. A person who loses perhaps a child or something terrible happens, they're diagnosed with cancer, and they ask the question, God, why do you do this? You can't exist if you've done this to me. It's not looking for a nice formula. And at that point, I think it's a question of the heart, and I don't know that we can really give an answer, or that anything other than Christ and various interaction with God through that suffering can bring about not a word sort of transaction, but a spiritual connection, a transformation of heart, a means, the grace of God, not just that they cope, but that they learn and they grow and they see God in their suffering. We can talk about those things. But in the end, it's a heart cry, and it can lead to despair, but you never can fully resolve the question of suffering, in my opinion, particularly in the examples that we'll look at later. Oh yes, one thing. So, the alternative. When I said Western world, that's very general. You could find lots of exceptions to that. But the Eastern world, do they ask, does anyone know, what do they say about suffering? Do you know? Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, not so much, I don't know about Muslim exactly. They say, life is suffering. Life is about getting away from suffering. And this is the myth or the proverb that they tell. They say, there's a warrior. He's running. He gets shot in the chest with an arrow. He looks at the arrow. He doesn't ask where it's from. That's stupid. He grabs the arrow and he thinks, how can I end this pain? And that is a summarization of Hindu and Buddhist life. Like, I've been shot with an arrow. I'm never going to ask where it came from because I can't in that religion. I have to just see how can I get rid of it. And why can't they ask where did this come from? Well, you can read a lot of books about Eastern religion, and the best example that I could come up with is like a creation story, and I think this comes from an ancient Hindu teacher. He says, in the beginning, so to speak, well, there was nothing. There was no existence of anything, but there was also an existence of something. You said, that doesn't make sense. That's a contradiction. Unfortunately, anyway, those religions are built on contradictions to the point where they take one side and the other side, they put them together, and you go and meditate on it, even though it doesn't make any sense. That in the beginning there was nothing, and in the beginning there was something. You put those two together, and you sit in your hut, and you in the lotus position, and you try to reach nirvana, and you just numb your mind. That's what my professor said when he was talking about it. How can you argue with that? When there's an inconsistency in your religion, the teacher says, now go and meditate on it and resolve in your mind that contradiction. That doesn't make any sense. Moving forward, they say that the suffering is always the result of desire. Like, okay, I'm hungry. It could cause desire. I'm thirsty. Maybe I want some money. Maybe I want to take something from someone. On and on. And all those desires, yes, they do cause suffering. But there are also desires for good things. Like there was a monk, and they asked them who had a family. He said, "Don't you want to see your family?" Well, yes. There's a desire that's good. So that breaks apart as well. But in the Eastern religion, life is suffering. They don't really ask. It's in the Western world where things must be square and just that we say, wait a second, if there's really a God, he would not allow this. And that is a very interesting statement to make and a very interesting conversation to have with a non-believer. I'm going to look into what I would call a study of Job, but it's an interesting answer. I don't know if you've ever looked at the end of Job and thought, why did God say that? What did Job do afterwards? How did this book ever get written? I don't know what you thought. In Job chapter 1, it says that in the last verse, it says that in all this, Job did not sin. Okay, so the first chapter, bad stuff happens, and then moving on in chapter 2, his body is attacked. So he loses children, the houses fall down, and all that, or whatever. So on and so forth, the story. He loses everything except for his wife and his 3 friends, which aren't much of a help. And in that chapter, the very important says he did not sin. But then if you read for the next 38 chapters or so, he says a lot of things that sound really bad. That we wouldn't want to say that. That sounds really unchristian. But in that, he did not sin. In Job chapter 3, he says, I curse the day that I was conceived, or the night I was conceived, and the day I was born. Really? It's a very interesting thing to say. And then he goes on, and then around Job chapter 4 or 5, then his 3 friends start talking. And if we can learn anything from the middle of Job, it's that what? If you have a friend who's going through an experience that you've never experienced, you should do what? And, various health issues, and I met someone, it's like, oh, you have the same issue, almost exactly the same. There was sort of an instant bond because, hey, that really was difficult, wasn't it? Yes, it was really painful, and we didn't have to say anything, we just got it. Okay. That's a little different. But these guys, they didn't really help the situation. And they talk a lot. So if you read it, it's on and on and on, chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter, and even his wife, whatever character she had, she said, you should just curse God and give up. I mean, perhaps she was tired of him. It doesn't make sense in that part. I don't know. All right, so Job is saying, look, God, look at all the things that have happened to me. I'm not sinning. I'm a righteous man, even though my friends say I've sinned and I should repent. But I don't have anything to repent of. Other than that, I wish I wasn't born. In Job 38, God answers, but as a child, I thought, or maybe you thought this too, well, shouldn't God tell him about, the conversations in heaven where God talks to Satan and Satan says, if I touch his body, he will turn on you? Doesn't God owe him a pretty good explanation? Maybe he should write it down and give it to him. Or maybe he should come down in a chair or some way, bring him up and say, hey, just so you know, this is what happened, word for word. Now, doesn't that make it better? Think about that. Would that make it better? You were on trial to see if you were a faithful man, and guess what? We beat him or something. Like, is that the best answer you could receive in that situation? I don't know. Anyway, in Job 38, we read this. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds in it, cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band. When I fixed my limit for it and set bars, and for 52 verses, Job has to stand there, and God is like, where were you when I did this? Where were you when I did this? You are incredibly small. You have an incredibly limited amount of knowledge about everything. How can you darken my counsel with questions? Is God just mocking Job? Like, I don't think so. We could add some, attitude to that, like, where were you? But in the end, as you look back on God's response to Job, he did not give details, he did not give reasons, he did not explain himself. He did not need to explain himself, because if he is good, if he is in charge, there is not necessarily a need for an explanation point by point for why this happened and this happened and this happened. In Job 38, God answers with what? He answers with statement after statement after statement that reaffirms his sovereignty. I am in control. I am in control. I am in control. And perhaps one of the longest dialogues anyone has ever had with God, God says, I am in control, and backs Job into a corner, and God is just so, you can imagine just the shaking Job, or God with just so much strength and power. Would you feel angry about that response? Would you feel like God hadn't answered your questions? Or would you feel like you were held in the palm of a sovereign God? And that sense of security was what you needed. I think that, at least in my life, and look back on different experiences of difficult times, you don't get answers, really. But what you do get is you get some deeper understanding of God. And furthermore, you understand, at least I learned as a teenager, that God is sovereign. Things don't happen because of your actions alone. It's because God is pulling you along. God is moving things. God is writing things that you don't even understand for the future. And he is sovereign. I did not understand that word until I went through difficult experiences, and I realized, if I had to go back, I wouldn't change that. That horrible experience, maybe you would agree or not agree with something in your life, I wouldn't change that, because in the end, I was a much better person, prepared for something else. So that's how, what I get from the book of Job. And eventually, Job responds, and then he gets and then everything gets back to order, right? And then he gets all his stuff back, I guess, or whatever. So, who wrote the book? Did Job ever find out what really happened? I don't know. I didn't look into it too much, but it's Job was written in a time we don't know. Where was it actually in the timeline of biblical history? It could fit a lot of places because it's Job, and then no mention of any surrounding kingdoms or times, or any mention of a timeline, sort of where does this fit? So he was out there somewhere. I said before that if we ask the question, how could a loving God allow this? We have to know that love, that word love, we have to have a better understanding of it. So first of all, love requires choice. So if you're married, well, I should be careful how I say this. If you're married and you were forced into that marriage, it might be difficult to have love for that person or whoever did that arranged marriage. I don't know. I'm with my son. He's a real lonely guy, not very good with social skills. I'll give you a 20. It's You mean, Dad or Mom, you pay my friends to come over and play with me? Yeah, because no one else is going to come over. Is that a very meaningful relationship? Because your parents give them money to be with you? They have different motivations other than being with you? No, that's terrible. That doesn't mean anything. In the same way, if people do not have a choice between the good fruit and the bad fruit, or literally anything, that choice nullifies or takes away love. If we were programmed to do everything that God wanted, it would be a meaningless story. So that we have love, we have a choice. If there were no choice, relationship would be meaningless. If there is a possibility of rejection, there is a possibility of pain. Okay, that is actually good. If there is a possibility of rejection. Here is Job's response. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. As I'm going to show, I have a video I'm going to play in a few minutes. It shows, first of all, the problem, and then it shows a Christian narrative or a Christian story that you probably know, and it kind of compares the two. And one of the statements they make in there is, an idea that comes through is, we are experiencing incredible suffering, and it doesn't make sense. Does that mean we run away from it, or we just give up on God? No, it's enough to know that we live in God's will, and it's enough to know Him. In essence, it's saying that I don't have any reason in words, but it's enough to know Christ to endure that suffering. And there are constant references, this is Corrie ten Boom, in her book to parallels between her suffering or an experience she has, but she always makes her experience sound so, even though it's so horrible, she makes it sound way down here, but then the example of Christ. So she will talk about how the prisoners were treated this way and how Christ was treated at his trial and crucifixion. And I think that's also important to see is the emotional and the physical suffering of Christ. If you were to think about Jesus' emotional suffering or Jesus' emotions, where is that really portrayed in the Bible or in the Gospels? There are some times when Jesus, it says he wept, or I'm not sure of any of the emotions that he ate, he drank, so on and so forth. There's not a lot of commentary on how Jesus expressed himself. But there is a time in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus says, I am sorrowful unto death. And he also says later on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, from Psalm 22. He also asked his disciples, humans, to stay up with him. In his humanity, though he was God, he was facing, drinking the cup, the wrath of God, he still asked for humans. It's just interesting. I think it really is astonishing that he asked for his disciples to stay awake with him because he didn't want to be alone in his humanity before the night of nights and the coming crucifixion. So it shows that the desire and that need for friendship and intimacy. And if we have suffering and we stay alone, that is very foolish. But Jesus shows us in his suffering, his stress, and his incredible suffering that so much of the capillaries, I think you call, broke down and blood came through his skin. I think that is incredible stress. That is not common. That is a medical term. I don't know the term. But that is not common, but Jesus experienced that. If you read the account then of the flogging and the crucifixion and all that went on, you know that Jesus knows through the Roman execution, which was they tried to make the most painful way to die. Jesus, as Peter says, is not a high priest who is not acquainted with our sufferings or not acquainted with grief or how we feel. He experienced what we experienced in the areas of emotional pain, of that his coming death. that grief, that sorrow, and so forth. He felt the rejection or the sin of all mankind on his shoulders, and his relationship to the Father. Why have you forsaken me? He experienced that physical, not crushing of the bones. He didn't break bones, but the stakes through his feet, the loss of blood, and the painful suffocation on the cross. So, where is an answer or a place to go? This may sound very simple. Where's the place to go when suffering is too much? When it seems that God is out of touch, so to speak, or that he does not understand. You don't understand God. You don't know how I'm feeling. And you can voice those laments or those pleas or something like that. But the truth is that at the cross, Jesus showed incredible pain that he did not deserve under the most unjust circumstances. And he redeems that pain. And I think that at the cross we find that answer. All right, at this time I'm going to play the video.
Poles, Czechs, Russians, Slavs, Dutch, Hungarians, Germans. I understand so few words. But when I do something to make them more comfortable or give them a little food or smile, their gratitude tears at my heart. When I hand out tiny pieces of chocolate, the poor souls are so excited and pleased, they just grab my hand and hold it. They wrap it in toilet paper and hide it under their sheets or mattresses. The poor souls still can't believe that they will get more later. You have to gently shake some of the patients to see if they're still alive. Their breathing is so shallow. Each time, I breathe a wee prayer for them. God, are you there? God, where are you?
Comfort the frightened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. Do not repay evil for evil, but always try to do good to one another. Always rejoice. Pray constantly. Give thanks in all circumstances. For this is the will of God in Jesus Christ.
And to the mindless, the word sounds so comforting. In this place, it's mockery.
God didn't make this place. Men did.
But he has power. Surely he could stop them. Unless, of course, he's a sadist.
Oh, no, he's love. All love.
Then he's impotent. You can't have it both ways, my dear.
You see what's around you. We see another world, just as real. Our life with God. Every day, it gets deeper and stronger. You think the two can't exist side by side, but we know they do. We live them both.
It's enough knowing that we're so much dung, moving from nothing to nothing. But you must believe your God smells that stench from those chimneys and refuses to do anything.
If only you could know his love.
I am Maria Procek, first violinist of the Warsaw Symphony Orchestra. Did your God will this?
We cannot answer. All I can say is, that the same God you are accusing came and lived in the midst of our world. And he was beaten. And he was mocked. And he died on a cross. And he did it for love. For us.
And why do you think you, a God of love, sent you here?
To obey him. If you know him, you don't have to know why.
All right, so what is called the greatest challenge to Christianity, I believe, is a heartfelt and very profound thing that our world cannot answer, and it's a very important discussion. If you get into a discussion or you just listen to someone suffering, it will change the entire dynamic of your conversation and what they're willing to hear and what you can offer them. Our world in general, it would seem that you don't hear, we never hear about death. That's one thing I think is true about secular society, that it avoids the topic of death to the extreme. I also think that there's not much to offer from that perspective on someone who's suffering, particularly not necessarily a mental illness, but someone who suffers through life with different issues, who doesn't understand. There's sort of this there's nothing that you can get from the secular societies. That's why I believe that our response is so important. These are the questions. First of all, our main question: how do you know that in a postmodern world there's not a solid foundation for truth? So once you dig down, how do you know that? Because this person told me, or that this is how I learned it from this book. You continue to question. Eventually it will come down to, what do I really believe? Or a contradiction which causes them to say, there's something wrong with my worldview. I need to rethink perhaps my foundational beliefs on that subject. What do you rely on to get through difficulties? I don't know if you've ever heard someone say something like this: oh, you have your Christianity, that's very nice. You have your Christianity, you believe in the Son of God, that's very nice. I don't believe in that, that's fine for you. You're crazy, I'm not. But they also might say something like, I'm just not into that. And the natural response is, well, if I have that and you're just not into that, what do you actually have to fall back on if things don't work out the way you want to? What if you're suffering? Where do you go for comfort? Because you need that. You can't cope with certain things. Why do you think so many people are addicted to drugs, alcohol, etc., and masking that pain? What do you lean on is a very valid question. What is your motivation for life? And have you dealt with suffering in life? Most people don't want to listen to that kind of story. If you can listen to a story about someone suffering, they will value that greatly. They can share that. I remember one time I asked someone, all I said was, hey, how you doing today, or something. And he just started talking about how he was struggling with drug addiction, like right off the bat. Like he had this drug addiction and he had fallen off the wagon, he said, and he was struggling and struggling, and he stops and he goes, oh, I thought like you really meant what you said, and I thought you cared or something. I was like, yeah, keep going, that's fine, It was really a kind of an abrupt, just went right into the conversation, but I think so many people have a story to, you could say, unload, because a selfish person or our world doesn't have, say, the foundation or maybe the bandwidth or the desire to hear other people's stories. And in a postmodern worldview, that's the key. So, as the video said, the world is the way it is. It looks absurd. It doesn't maybe make sense to you, but there's a reason. Obviously, you can go back to the Garden of Eden. You talk about sin and how sin ravages the world, and how Christ came into that world to bear sin. You can see Christ not as God is not as so much the monster in this story, but the one who is also a victim of suffering and of evil. And I think that makes the difference, at least for me, that when I think of Jesus, instead of the one up in heaven, saying, I'll help you, but not you. I'll stick this in your life, and I'll just keep sticking things in your life, and more things, and the more difficult it gets, the less I care. Instead, you see, he came down, he suffered, he died, he experienced those conditions. He was also a victim of pain. He's like, I'm right there with you. I'm sitting next to you. I understand. So that's my response. It's not an answer. My response to the question of suffering. We have 15 minutes or so, 10 minutes for questions. Yeah, I think often our problems look very small to that. And the actual effects on the people who went through that, not everyone, like people, the physical toll and mental toll of people that I think I've read this somewhere was extreme, and it affected them for the rest of their life. They did not all walk out, unscathed or something. And how people acted like animals under those situations, and the psychological torture and the experimentation and on and on and on. I don't think you can make it a scale of suffering where that's even on the scale, how dehumanizing it was. And if there's probably one example that people use the most, it's probably that one. I mean, really, we use concentration camp as the most extreme. We use Hitler always as the most extreme. There's nothing past that. And yeah, that's not like it's the standard for what suffering is, but it's truly an example we can never understand. Yeah, one thing Corrie ten Boom said, there is no pit so deep that the love of God does not go deeper still. I think we live in, or at least I feel like I live in sometimes a very narrow perspective of that. Like what suffering or challenges I experience don't demonstrate that. A pit nearly that deep, whatever she experienced was an extreme compared to the evil that she witnessed. So it's as if the world is, how would you say, it often feels so silent, as the people were talking about. It feels incredibly silent, like where are you, God? It's not that God is always showing up and saving the day. It's often silence, and we look in the Bible and there's years and 20 and 30 or 400 years of silence. It's not like this is an easy life. I think that's understanding what that word love, what that word choice means, and how God sometimes never speaks or doesn't speak for hundreds of years.
So, two questions on the answer definition of suffering. First of all, what is the premise that comes out of?
Suffering itself? Life is suffering. I think it's like the scattered, at least in Hinduism, there's like the Vedas and there's all these ancient texts, but they don't have a standardized like canon like we do. This is probably not, I'm probably not saying everything right, but I'll try. And they have all these gurus or teachers, and it just kind of comes up as a way to cope with life. And even their caste system is built into their mythology or their creation story. And I don't know when that was actually wrote down, because, was that really part of the foundation of Hinduism? I don't know that Hinduism today and Buddhism today is still doing the same thing. They have gurus here, they say contradictory things all the time. And even Buddha himself supposedly reached nirvana, where he was free of desire, so he would not have suffering. But immediately after he reached nirvana in his house or hut or whatever, he went out, washed himself, and ate and kept living his life like everyone else. So I guess that contradiction is okay for some reason. I think it's often the sayings. It's the central focus, I think, is the meditation, and it's not a concrete, structured, squared off religion like you could say. Well, Christianity, of course, has no contradictions, but even the other one God religions are more coherent. I don't see Hinduism as being necessarily coherent, especially when some people say tens of millions of gods, some say hundreds of millions of gods. There's a God for this village, and it looks like this, and there's the Hare Krishnas, and it's almost madness to think of how many deities they have registered in their registry. Like that's not coherent to us. And I think it's like a mythology that grew into a way of living life, coping with life, surrounded by meditation. That's the best answer I can give. Yeah, I met a Buddhist. He was Buddhist, and I was talking to him, and he talked about his parents were Buddhists. He had some very enlightening ideas. He had a plan for the world to be saved. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. And he talked about his religion and I don't remember what all he said. And I knew the answer to this, I thought. And it was quite an interesting discussion. And you never get it's not a wrestling match. You don't pin someone down. But eventually we got to this point. I was like, so in your religion, you believe that perhaps there's A and B. There's nothing in the world in the beginning. There's nothing existing, and there's something existing. That's a contradiction. So how do you deal with that? He says, well, like the synthesis. You take A and B, and you get C, and you just keep going and going and going. And I said, but so that's not. There's never really a choice. It's never either or. It's never either or. He's like, in the American way, we say either I go across the street or I get hit by the bus going across the street. That's a physical example. That's different than religion. Oh, I said to him, so why is it that in religion you choose to be contradictory, but nowhere else in your life do you choose to be contradictory? That's a very either-or statement. He was like, he's not sure. I don't know what he was thinking. He's like, and I said to him, if you walk up to your boss and you say, hey, why didn't you pay me? He said, I paid you. He said, no, you didn't. Same thing. Where's synthesis? Why only religion and not the other? It's either or. You've already selected either contradiction or not contradiction. And he just laughed. He went, I should talk to you some more. And he gave me this address to his channel of discussion. It's called, I still have it. It's Metamorphosis, Humanity Unlocked. And if you read it, it's about obtaining higher consciousness. In Buddhism, you obtain higher consciousness until you get to nirvana or whatever, and then you're one with God, whatever that really means. And if we all throughout the West and East do this, countries will cease, governments will go away, and we will all be one. It's always one. Yeah, it was really, really interesting, but that's what he believes. And then later he asked me for $350. I'm not sure why. He said that he would get it back that weekend. This is what happens. People just try to rip you off, and then they have sincere moments, and then this sounds almost like repeat. He said he was going to be a chess match, and he's for sure going to win, and he'll get the money back to me. And I was like, okay. And he said that it's this chess match. So I went online and found it. I was like, you're in the middle of the ratings. You're not going to win for sure. He's like, I'm pretty sure I will. I said, no. So that was the end of that. What he did was, I sent him an email or no response on that platform. I said, this is what I believe. This is my whatever critique of it and all that. I really wanted him to read it. He never read it. And then he read it, and then he called me and asked for the money. And I said, I read it. It's a lot of great ideas. Can I have some money? So, yeah, that was a bit disappointing, but that's the world, I guess. And it's never like we go out and evangelize.